Hello? Oh. I did not see you there. Hello. I have a new chair now, which you may not have noticed. It's very, very fluffy and soft and good for kitty. That's why it's like, because it's not a hardback chair the way the last one was. I wondered when you were going to sit on it. It smells new and different, so they've been avoiding it. Hello, everyone. Welcome, Julie, Jeff, Natasha, Quinn, Lobsol. I'm reading something new today, something I wrote, which I actually read for the Discord a while back when I first wrote the beginning of it. But I got kind of stuck on it and didn't really know what else to do with it for a while, so I just kind of left it be. And then in the last month or so, I've kind of touched up on it again and figured, well, I asked Discord, I was like, would y'all want to hear a story I wrote? And people were like, yes. I was like, okay, I guess that's what we're doing. It is a story about vampires. It started as me trying to make Castlevania gayer than it already is. But it kind of went in a different direction, and, I don't know, it's kind of a story about, trauma and hunting and what that would actually do to a person, but also it's gay eventually. I haven't gotten that far yet, but, it doesn't really have a name, so we're just gonna call it the vampire story, I suppose. Oh, the music's not playing. Let's, see how that's going. And I guess we're gonna read this story. It's 20 pages. I don't know how long that'll take, but we'll see if we can power through it and see what y'all think. It's been a very long time since I've written original fiction in any, serious form of trying to create and finish a story, so we'll see if I've still got anything going for me. The mountain was a sentinel in the dark, a looming shadow stretching into the endless black of the night. The flicker of flame illuminated the white snow beneath his feet, the lantern in his hand shaking with every step, fire shivering with the wind. Nathan focused on putting one boot in front of the other. His legs sunk into snow to the knees with every step, and he was getting weary of dragging them out again. If the weather didn't kill him, the boredom would. Hours of tedious climbing, wind howling in his ears, seeing nothing but pure white 5 feet in front of him, was enough to drive a patient man wild. Nathan was not a patient man. It couldn't be much longer. Just keep pushing, and then he'd never have to push this hard again. When he finally made it to the town, it was as underwhelming as they'd told him. A tiny frozen hamlet halfway up the mountain, houses huddled together like they were trying to conserve heat. Not 100 people could possibly live there, and the whole of the town consisted of about 20 houses, an inn, a graveyard, and a broken fountain in the courtyard in the center of town. Hi, Daniel. Welcome. We've only just begun. You've not missed much. The inn was aptly named The Inn, and it saw a handful of travelers across the whole year, and nearly none in winter. The owners made most of their living as a bar, and when Nathan walked in, every one of the townsfolk turned to look at him with wide-eyed shock and surprise. He didn't take much notice of it, stomped up to the bar and sat down, just beginning to feel the burn of exertion as his body slowed down. He was still too cold to be removing layers, but he took off his gloves and hat anyway. They were soaked through with slush. Messy auburn hair fell round his ears as he did. Flattened and soaked with water, the threadbare hat hadn't been prepared to keep away. "You're a new face round here." The woman behind the bar approached with a hard look. It was all right. Given what he looked like, he wouldn't have trusted himself either, but he couldn't answer to soothe her worries if he wanted to. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed to a bottle of whiskey behind the bar. The motion irritated the barmaid. "What, can't ask politely?" Nathan just shook his head, wearing a weary frown himself. "No, I can't." Those are in italics. I don't know how I guess I'll just... if it's in first person, he's thinking, I guess. I'll specify it if I need to. You come here and say hello! Say hello. Hello. Mwah. Mwah. After a moment, she sighed. "You got coin?" She barely said it before he was shoving his hands into his jacket and pulling out his coin purse. He had plenty of that to spare, though he supposed it had to last for a long time now. Rest of my life. She picked up a coin, nibbled on an edge. Nathan didn't know if that trick really did tell fake coins from real ones, but the barmaid seemed satisfied. A glass was put in front of him, then another, and both were filled to the brim. Finally, after hours of hell, he had a good drink, and feeling was returning to his fingers and toes. And for better or worse, he was home. Not that this was his home. His childhood was on the roads, in the back of wagons, in the saddle, sleeping under the stars. Neither of his parents had any connections to the town. It just happened to be where they were when his mother was 7 months on and too pregnant to keep traveling. They barely waited a year before hitting the road again after he was born, but that was their way. Hard to make money hunting monsters sitting in the same old town. You had to go seek out the dark places, the towns near the edge of the forest or the base of a mountain with old secrets, who hesitate to so much as whisper about them even in daylight. They couldn't handle the ancient things in those deep reserves, but his family could. His parents were part of a long tradition. So was his uncle and 2 cousins, born to an aunt he'd never known. He had 4 siblings, too, and a grandmother who'd retired from the life and spent her golden years in the city before passing on in bed. She was the only one. Catherine, the eldest sibling, went first. The troll should have been an easy mark, but Dad had taken a bad hit from a lich the hunt before and had been slow. She took the blow aimed for him, and it crushed both her legs. She bled out on the cave floor. Dad didn't take it well. Didn't take it well when his brother, Uncle Isaac, went a few years later, torn apart by a vamp he'd been foolish enough to take on his own. His kids outlived him by decades, but the life claimed them too, eventually. Ma passed first, an infected wound after a rather brutal fight against a dark magic coven, which took months to take her life. That was the final blow that really killed Dad. Not the claws that eventually ripped his neck open, but the tragedies that tore his heart apart the years before. That left him, his younger brother Terry, sister Rachel, and elder brother George. They lasted together for a while, some long years on the road. They were good years. George found a girl and almost settled down. They got married, and she got the idea in her head that a life on the road was romantic. Panicked during a fight with a werewolf, didn't listen and stay in the cart like she was told, tried to run for the woods and got herself, her unborn child, and her newlywed husband killed. Merfolk got Terry, pulled him under too far down too fast. They never saw him again. Then it was the 2 of them, Rachel and Nathan, and now... Nathan's grip on the whiskey glass tightened, a hairline crack running through it. Now it was just him. He tipped the rest back in one big gulp, set it back down, and pulled out a few more coins for the barmaid, left them on the counter. He walked out before the glass could realize it was broken and collapse on the countertop. You see, it started, gay vampires, and it became... How traumatic would it be to be a hunter hunting monster? I don't know, maybe I was reading too much Witcher, but oops, there's still more. Welcome, Maddie, thanks for joining us. I swear there's happy and gay in it eventually. He met the mayor in the morning, after a long night on the mountainside. Didn't stay at the inn. He slept under the stars, a final farewell of a sort. One last night with the only constant companion his life had. It felt like a goodbye, as foolish as it was, given the sky wasn't going anywhere. Nathan frowned and shoved the sentimental thought away. Unlike with the barmaid, Nathan came prepared. On a stained piece of paper, he'd written his intentions, a letter explaining who he was, why he was here, what he wanted to do. It'd been in his bag for months, ever since he started heading to the mountain. The mayor looked baffled to be handed it, but after a quick read, was delighted to allow him to purchase a shitty, half-collapsed hut on the edge of town that looked like no one had lived in it for years. That was fine. It had a roof and a door, and that was more than enough. He was the talk of the town by morning, but that was fine too. He expected it in a town this small. Not only was he a stranger, a person from out of town, but a hunter, a monster killer. He hadn't told a soul, but there was no doubt it was obvious even to them. He carried a blade on his back. The scars of old kills stood out bold on his face. There were rumors and whispers following him around the tiny hamlet. He felt the stairs boring into his back as he walked the market, buying potatoes and bread and what little vegetables there were available. Then he went home. The whispers grew quieter the longer he stayed. Oh, they still talked about him, but it was no longer such a shock to see him on the street that chatter erupted around him whenever he went. They kept their rumors behind closed doors, and they kept their distance, and that suited him just fine. He had enough to keep him occupied. The house was all but falling down around him, and Nathan was thankful for the work. Each day he woke, ate and cleaned himself, massaged the old ache in his knee that acted up whenever the weather turned, and set about chores around the place. Are you having a sneeze? He's okay. Oh, baby. He has this happen sometimes. It's okay. He's very small, so hairballs are no fun. He's okay. He's okay. You good? Aww. You okay? Oh my goodness. That's a long one. You all good? Yeah, you okay. Say, I'm okay. Poor baby. Alright. 2 weeks after moving in, he took his work outside. It was midday when he felt eyes on him. For a moment he faltered, decades-old training kicking in, his eyes narrowing and his hold on the hammer in his hands adjusting. But as soon as the truth was revealed, he relaxed. Kids stood outside his yard, at the tree line, just watching him. He could hear their laughter, their quiet dares that no one was brave enough to take on. It was almost disappointing. He ignored them and kept building his fence. Nathan wasn't exactly sure why he was building a fence, but he'd seen lots of normal houses, and they had fences, so fence. Maybe he'd get a dog. Normal people had dogs, too. That was how he spent his days. He built a fence. He fixed the broken window that was letting in all the cold air, though it did not change how cold the house was. He put gutters on the roof, curtains on the windows to block out the morning sun, built a shelf to keep all his parents' research on. The day after the shelf was finished, he sat to organize their works and found himself flipping the pages, reading accounts and anecdotes written by the long dead, tracing the handwriting of his siblings where they'd added their thoughts in the margins. He finally realized how much time had passed when it became too dark to read, and shoved all the books onto the shelf in a haphazard and orderless fashion. Half his days were spent chopping wood. Wood for the fire, wood to repair the house, wood to build furniture, hefting the heavy axe over his shoulder, swinging down, seeing in his mind blood and limbs and battlefields from ages past as the blow came down. The only limbs he severed were from trees. At night, he stayed inside, avoiding the bitter chills of evening. He slept on the rug in front of the fire, burning all his hard work. The flames danced, and he watched into the early hours, seeing campfires on the road, hearing old laughter and voices alongside familiar faces, shut his eyes and rolled away, putting his back to the light. It was the middle of winter, and unlikely to get much warmer any time soon, so Nathan went hunting, not just for meat, but for pelts. Brought his bow, and out of habit, his sword, the worn sheath slipping comfortably on his back, settling into place like an old friend. He felt far more like himself suddenly. The forest was quiet, still. It wasn't snowing, thank the gods, but it was cold as hell all the same. His footsteps were the only sound, the only break in the pristine layer of snow on the ground. His eyes trailed the sky, the horizon, and he remembered his father's lessons. They'd hunted plenty on the road. Animals as well as monsters. Is this a first draft? Do you usually write multiple drafts for your stories? I tend to write like one draft, but I go back and I reread it and I tweak it and tweak it and tweak it, and it sits in my folder for 3 years and I keep tweaking it. But I've rewritten a couple of different stories, definitely. This is the most modern, the most recent thing I've written. It's probably only like a year old. He always preferred fighting the monsters. They got what was coming to them. The deer he saw in the distance did nothing wrong. They didn't tear through a small village, ripping out townsfolk's organs and splaying them across the earth, not to eat, but just to play. They didn't torment and torture their prey as they slowly ate them alive. Bow cocked, the arrow fell and struck. The rest of the herd panicked and fled, cries echoing through the once silent woods, and the injured one shrieked unholy hell. It fell on its side, limbs flailing, blood staining the pristine snow in pink droplets. Nathan gave a silent apology as he broke its neck. Skinning it, tanning the hide, and prepping the meat took the next few chunks of days from him, and by the end he was warmer and fuller for it. Still slept with a fire, still spent his days chopping wood, fixing the leaky roof and the cracks in the well on the back of the property. Still lots to do. It was his third week in town when Nathan realized the gaggle of kids following him had turned into just one. He'd started tuning them out, ignoring their presence because they were practically always there and completely harmless. But eventually he realized he could tell someone was watching him, but he wasn't hearing the usual din of childish squealing out in the woods. He carefully checked the perimeter as he set down his axe and stretched, an excuse to lift his head from his work. Yep, one kid, ducking behind a tree as soon as he lifted his head. He didn't see much but long hair fluttering behind them as they hid. Having satisfied his own curiosity, he went back to work and ignored them. The steps on the porch were rotten. He'd stepped through one yesterday. The only thing keeping his leg from becoming a pincushion was his habit of wearing thick protective boots. They were part of the armor he wore, resistant to poisons and reinforced, hard for a monster to break through and impossible for a human. Not that he needed to worry about that here. Still, he wore them every day. He was working on nailing the last piece down when someone touched his shoulder. Nathan spun, the hammer in his hand. I worded that twice. Nathan spun, the hammer in his hand spun round to face his opponent as he turned. How would I word that? Holding the hammer in his hand as he spun round? Nathan spun round, holding the hammer in his hand as he turned to face his opponent, other hand reaching out to grab the enemy, and froze as soon as he saw wide, terrified eyes staring at him from below. "Wow," the girl whispered, falling backwards on the ground, gawking. "You really are a hunter, huh?" Frowning, Nathan huffed and knelt again, returning to his work. The pounding of the hammer was the only sound until he heard the girl shuffling her feet. "Why are you here?" She moved into his line of sight, trying to peer at what he was doing. "Is there a monster around? Are you going to kill it?" He kept working. Eventually, she realized he wasn't going to respond and leave. "What's your name?" Bang. Bang. "You really don't talk?" He stalled. The hammer stumbled on the last blow and nicked his finger, but the light bruise was just an annoyance. Nathan lifted his head and after a moment nodded. "Huh." The girl looked more curious than anything. "Then how do you talk to people?" "I don't." He huffed, amused, and shook his head. "Right, you don't talk, but you gotta, tell people stuff, right?" "Sure, but the people he could tell stuff to were all dead." He shrugged and picked the hammer back up. "Can you write, notes for people to read?" The hammer fell one last time and the step was repaired. He sat back on his knees and admired a job well done that didn't require any bloodletting at all. It was a thought that occurred to him nearly every day, and he could not get it to stop. "If I brought you a notebook, could you write to me?" Narrowed eyes and a dry expression of annoyance were her answer as Nathan turned to face the girl. She just smiled. "My name's Ariel." She waved as if she wasn't standing right in front of him. "I was born here, but I want to go be a hunter one day too." Nathan's expression fell, his hand gripping the hammer tight. Ignoring the girl, he gathered his tools, stood, stomped up his new stairs, and slammed the door shut behind him. She came back, just like she promised, with a notebook and a pencil, and set it on the deck next to where Nathan was replacing rotten pieces of wood. He eyed it with a narrow glare, glancing at the impetuous girl, who seemed immune to the aura of fuck off that he was exuding. "So what's your name?" She asked 3 times, the last in a sing-song voice that transformed into a full song, before Nathan sighed and picked up the pencil. "Nathan." The girl beamed. "I'm Ariel. I told you that. Anyway, hi!" She waved again. Nathan's heart warmed, and he tried to tell himself it was heartburn. "So why are you here?" Realizing she was an impossible child and he was going to get no work done until she left, Nathan finally set the hammer aside and started talking to her. Retired. Retired from what, hunting? Her mouth shaped into a surprised O. I didn't know hunters did that. They don't. Then why are you? Because I like not being dead. The little girl's face paled, and for just a second he felt guilty. Then he remembered the girl's heartfelt declaration from the day before and frowned. But you help people, she insisted. If hunters don't fight monsters, what will people do? Defend their own damn selves, maybe? Or they could die instead of every member of his family. How about that? The pencil snapped in half in his hand. Nathan wanted to apologize, but the girl thought it was cool. She left, promising to come back with more pencils the next day, and she wanted to learn how to snap them, too. Nathan watched her go with a sinking feeling in his gut. Every day, sometime after school let out, Ariel showed up on his land. He made a habit of cutting firewood around that time, so he would be out and looking for her. Ignoring her hadn't worked. Maybe eventually her curiosity about hunters would wear off and she'd leave him alone. Once she showed up, she'd hand over her notebook and ask her questions, usually about hunting, sometimes just about him. Half the time, they didn't even talk about him. The girl would end up rambling on a tangent on any old thing, delighted to talk to him about her schoolwork or annoying classmates, her mom, stories about the fae folk and the forest and the ruins of the castle higher up the mountain. Castle? Oh, yeah! They sat on the porch where Ariel bounced in place out of excitement. There's an old ruined castle up near the top of the mountain. It's supposed to be abandoned, but everyone knows there's a vampire up there. Nathan's heart leapt into his throat. I mean, nobody's ever seen him, and nobody's been attacked, but it's what everyone says. It was his house a long time ago, and he just went to sleep and didn't wake up, I guess. It took a moment for his breathing to slow and calm to return. An old vampire, resting, in stasis probably. Not an immediate problem, but one that could certainly be one far down the line, years, even decades later when it woke up. Something he would have to deal with. Are you okay? Nathan turned to the girl and to his surprise noticed something like concern on her face. He tried to smile, but it was weak and stiff, the muscles out of practice. Still, it made her smile back. She kept coming back, and he kept letting her. Working in the yard turned into having lunch by the fireplace, the girl sitting in a chair near the open doorway. He was a stranger in this town, an adult man, and he didn't want anything unsavory being said or believed. He was kind of shocked the girl's mom hadn't put a stop to this already. Oh, Mom knows I'm here, Ariel insisted. She likes you. She said you're probably harmless and you look lonely. I thought so, too. She said it with such childish innocence. It shouldn't slice into his gut like a hot knife, but, well. Do you have a family? Slowly, he shook his head. Not anymore. Oh, did they? He nodded. Fighting monsters? He nodded again. I'm sorry. She sat in silence for a few minutes, chewing on the jerky in her hand. It was all he'd had, not prepared to offer snacks to some kid dropping in at any time. He ate bread and dried meat, slept on a pallet on the floor, barely had 2 pieces of furniture in the house, even though he'd been there nearly 2 months. Ariel sat up and suddenly stood. Do you want to meet my family? Somehow he found he couldn't say no. Ariel's family lived in a somewhat bigger hovel than Nathan's, near the center of town. People openly stared at the two of them as they walked, his giant form dwarfing the tiny girl holding on to his hand. Her little palm was swallowed up in his glove, and he was glad for once to be wearing them. He didn't think he could handle this if he wasn't. Without any sort of warning or invitation, Ariel dragged him into her house, shouting for her mother and exclaiming she'd brought her a new friend. Nathan stood in the doorframe, Ariel slipping from his grip as she ran to find her mother, and he had half a mind to turn and run far, far away. Down the mountain, possibly. But before he could, a woman about a decade older than him came round the corner. I was wondering when we might finally meet. She said the words with a smile, but Nathan didn't believe it. I've heard so many stories about you, Mr. Nathan. I feel as if we already have. I'm Deborah. Her eyes traveled over him, and he felt so very seen. Well, come in. You're letting in the chill. With no choice, he let the door slide closed behind him. Please, take a seat. Dinner will be ready in a moment. He shook his head even as Ariel pulled him to the table. A family like this on the mountain where food was scarce and times always tight. He had food. He couldn't take theirs. But just like her daughter, Miss Deborah wouldn't take no for an answer. A thin, watery broth of potatoes, onions, and thin strips of meat was sat before him, and with 2 bright eyes on him, he picked up his spoon and started to eat. "What brings you to our tiny hamlet, sir?" Deborah asked. The notebook Ariel always brought with her was on the table between the 3 of them, but he never had the chance to write on it. "He's a retired hunter!" Ariel bounced in her seat the way she always did when she was excited. "He's been on tons of adventures killing monsters and stuff, but he's really old now, so he quit." He almost glared at the really old, but it was a better answer than the truth, so he refused to say. Really old. The mother seemed more amused than anything by the comment, but she seemed to agree with him. "Though I suppose with a job like that you'd feel your age faster than most, but you can't be a day over 35, Mr. Nathan, if you'll pardon an older woman's curiosity." 37. "I'm turning 8 in 3 months, Ariel happily told them. "You're both really old to me." It was a lovely evening. The conversation had an ebb and flow. Deborah would attempt to ask him a question. Ariel would excitedly leap in to answer for him, and he found himself nodding along as both adults exchanged bemused looks and indulged the girl. Once or twice he even had a chance to get his own comment in, but he didn't mind being spoken over this time. It was honestly a nice night. He was sent home with some of the soup, despite his many attempts to leave it behind. Deborah picked it back up off the table, where he deliberately left it, and shoved it into his hands as he walked out the door. And Nathan felt warm as he walked home. It became tradition. He worked on his house during the day. Ariel would come and spend the afternoon playing on his land as he finished up what he was doing, and then he'd walk her home and spend the evening with the family. He'd tried to refuse, and found the mother to be as stubborn as the daughter, and in the end, at the least, forced them to let him contribute his own ingredients to the meals. It became an even trade. He provided meat and what other things he had, and Deborah cooked, and she was far more talented at it than he. It had been something of a running joke at his family's camp. Of all his siblings, he'd always was the one burning breakfast. He could almost hear his mother's voice saying. Nathan clamped down on the thought and loosened his grip before he could bend the spoon in his hand. They were lovely people, and their obvious acceptance of him warmed much of the town to him. None of them invited him into their house like Deborah, but they greeted him when he passed and didn't frown when all he did was nod and smile. The children returned, demanding he teach them tricks of his trade that he'd never heard of, perform magic and skills he had no idea existed, and usually ended up in the middle of a one-sided snowball fight instead. It was a good life. Nathan laid awake at night and hated how good it was. He slept on the floor, without a fire anymore, forcing himself to feel the bitter chill down to his bones. Near the door sat his bags, all his life's belongings, packed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. Potions and poultices, armor and equipment, grimoires and charms, all prepared for him to step back into his boots and walk away, disappear down the mountain and return to the old life, to die like a hunter. He didn't want to, and he hated that he didn't. Months became a year. The Yule came and went, and Nathan found himself welcoming a new year in with Deborah and Ariel. The young girl had clearly been taken with him, not quite a father or a brother, though she seemed to wish for the former if her behavior was any sign, winking at him and pushing him towards her mother while they worked in the kitchen, scooting their chairs closer at the dinner table. The adults recognized it for what it was and took it in stride, and Nathan, embarrassed, was more amused than anything, and when he realized it didn't upset Deborah. She was too young to remember her father when he passed, she explained to him once. She just wants what everyone else has. One day she'll realize she does, even if it isn't quite the same as the rest. That had been more of a shock than anything. The idea that Deborah trusted him, liked him enough to let Ariel view him as a father figure. Not that anyone could stop her. It was like she was a duck imprinted on him, trying to follow him on hunts and trips out of town, few as they were. It should have been an annoyance, but it was a blessing. His entire life had been loud and full of people, always on the road, always talking and bickering. Ariel's voice filled the silence the way he and the ghosts haunting him couldn't. It made it a little easier to lay on the floor at night and sleep in the quiet. A year later, he still didn't have a bed, and the bag was still by the door. It was getting warmer, if only slightly, as the summer months approached, and Nathan walked with Ariel to the house. So there was 5 of them, I think, but I don't remember the names, and each of them made one of the immortal races. She started counting on her fingers. Mermaids, giants, dwarves, elves. I forgot the last one. Fae. Right, each of the gods made those, but they wanted to make another race, but they were all out of stardust. So we didn't get any, and that's why we die. The girl furrowed her brow and frowned. That's a stupid excuse. I don't like that story. Nathan smiled despite himself and tried to hide it when the girl glared at her. It is! He was spared a worse tirade as they arrived at the house and he pushed the door open for her. Dinner's scent was already wafting out, warm and inviting, and as Nathan started removing his cloak, then his scarf. It was pretty warm for once. Wash your hands. I'll be out in just a moment. Oh, no, that's not the relationship, Daniel. She's a baby. No. The love interest will show up at some point. Deborah called from the kitchen. Nathan turned to the nearby wash bin and obeyed. Ariel, rushing right through the doorway to her mother, didn't. Mom, today in class we read this story in history about the gods. He shook his head as she started to repeat the tale exactly the way she'd told it to him. In a month she'd be 9. What a thought. Had it only been a year since he'd arrived? Since he'd met the child? It felt like it had been an age and only a day. Perhaps one very long, exhausting day. Nathan doesn't think... The girl's sudden silence piqued his curiosity, and he turned and saw her staring at him with an expression he hadn't seen since they first met. He frowned, confused, and then with sudden clarity lifted his hand to his throat. Is something wrong? Deborah followed in, dinner plates in hand, setting them on the table as she walked past the frozen girl. Ariel, sweetheart, what are you staring for? She followed the girl's gaze to Nathan's hand, where he poorly covered the pale, scarred flesh of his neck. He hadn't thought about it. It was always so cold here. He was always wearing so many layers. She must not have seen the scar before. Nathan wasn't sure why he felt self-conscious about it. He had plenty of scars and never cared, but something about how she was staring. The corners of her eyes started to water, and the girl sniffled. Nathan blinked. What? Suddenly, Ariel spun to her room and ran inside and shut the door with a loud slam. Stunned, Nathan lowered his hand, fully revealing the jagged tear of healed skin, like a dog had tore into his throat and ripped half the flesh off. It was an old wound. It hadn't occurred to him to even think about it. Deborah sighed and turned to him. She's not seen it before, has she? Neither had Deborah, though she seemed to be taking it better. Perhaps she saw the confusion in his eyes because she continued, Those lines on your face look tough to a little girl who doesn't know the pain that comes with getting them. But no one can pretend a wound like that wouldn't be fatal. Oh, I'm honestly a little woozy at the thought myself. Is that why... I can't speak. He nodded. She approached, a hand half lifted. She met his gaze with a question, and he nodded his assent. She prodded gently at the flesh, revealing the origin of the wound, the bite marks on either side of his neck. Gods above, she whispered, and made the mark of the travelers on her breast. I'm glad you're still with us, my boy, for your sake and my girl's. She seemed to hesitate a moment, then Deborah hugged him tightly. It was over so fast he hardly knew what to think of it. She'll be all right. I'll go speak to her. Please, eat before it gets cold. The look in her eyes said it was an order, not a request. Nathan wasn't much hungry anymore. I'm glad y'all are enjoying it. It was the one and only time he ever fought a vampire alone. His uncle had gone on ahead, done the one thing every hunter is forbidden from doing, acting on emotion. The second victim had been a friend, a good friend, and the creature had toyed with him before finally hanging him outside the temple by his innards. Uncle Isaac had taken it very poorly. They'd made plans the night before to attack the crypt as a group the next evening, once they'd restocked and had a good rest. But Isaac didn't want to wait. It had been luck that had Nathan walk out of the apothecary in time to see his uncle's silhouette moving with the crowds towards the edge of town. With no choice but to let him go alone, or lose sight of him, he followed. There was a reason his father had begged Uncle Isaac to wait, to be cautious. Vampires were dangerous creatures. Few of them interacted with humankind. They didn't need blood to survive, didn't need much of anything, and even sunlight, dangerous as it was, took a long time to kill the oldest ones. Vampires were as near to being fey as any physical creature could be, and they shared all the same traits: immense beauty and strength, near immortality, and immense magical power. No single human could take one alone. 2, perhaps, might survive, Nathan had thought. But back then, Nathan had never met a vampire before. By the time his family had realized what had happened, Uncle Isaac was in pieces across the crypt, and the beast had latched itself onto Nathan's throat. That was what saved them. Feeding had distracted the creature and left it vulnerable to his father's spear in its back. Nathan had no memory of any of it. Screams and pain, blurry and distant faces, but apparently the thing that almost killed him was what saved him in the end. The blood, his mother told him the next morning. Vampires carry magic in their veins. They feed on blood, and their blood can heal us. Strange, huh? Her smile had been sad and exhausted. It had been the beginning of the long, slow end. By the next day, Ariel was herself again, though she never asked to examine the scar on his neck, the way she'd one time poked and prodded the burns on his arms and cuts on his face. She told him about her day, her schoolwork, what she was doing with her friends, and they walked to dinner together. Life was normal. Life was not normal. Hadn't been normal since he arrived. Time passed. The girl sprung up a foot, tall and skinny as a string bean, and she started attracting attention. Nathan made sure to teach her what his father had taught her sister. What his father had taught his sisters. To not let boys be boys, to not allow any pulling of pigtails. Not that it seemed like it would be an issue, as everyone in town knew about Ariel's enormous, quiet shadow, and for once, the healthy amount of fear seemed useful to him. What's an apothecary? It's a kind of like old-fashioned doctor. In fantasy settings, they tend to be somebody that makes like potions and medicine and stuff. One night, as Ariel played in the snow with her friends, Nathan stood with Deborah and the other parents. Other parents? Was that what he was? At the edge of a pond in the woods. It was just barely warm enough to not wear 2 layers, and the ice was thawed. Children splashed about and played in the shallows, cracking the ice. "It's been a fair winter," one of the fathers commented. Nathan only half heard the conversation. His eyes were on Ariel waiting in the water, putting another girl in a headlock and pulling her under with her, both cackling the whole time. He smiled. "That's my girl." "Too fair, ask me," one woman retorted. "The snow's never faded this early in May, not in all my years." "It's a warm year." "Too warm, ask me," the woman replied. "My sister in Norterra says they've had no snow at all the whole year. No snow." "They're down in the valley. What kind of surprise is that?" "It's unheard of to have no snow at all." What mundane worries these people had, Nathan found himself thinking. What little trivialities they were allowed to care about. "Martha, dear, it's all right," Deborah said finally, her voice a bit hoarse. She'd been having a lot of sore throats lately. The snow couldn't melt fast enough, he thought. If it would end this endless flu she seemed to suffer from the last month. He'd given her some teas that helped, but he couldn't seem to make it go away. "Oh, it's all right then. It doesn't bother you none." "It's weird," she admitted slowly, "but I don't think weird is enough to mean it's an ill omen of things to come. The weather changes for lots of reasons." "The weather changes for one reason, and we all know it. You're just too scared to say it," the elder woman insisted, and after a pause, perfectly timed for drama, said, "Fey folk. It's the Fey folk, swear on my heart and the gods above." From his position in the crowd, only Nathan could see Deborah roll her eyes, and he barely managed to hold back a laugh. But the urge died all at once, at the change of expression on Deborah's face. Suddenly she didn't look well. Her eyes narrowed. Pain tightened her expression, and then, all at once, she kneeled forward and coughed so hard it sounded like a bark, again and again into the palms of her hands. Nathan knelt and watched in shock as it happened, hands steadying her shoulders, as the others crowded round in surprise, chattering and shouting at one another. The kids had stilled in the water, realizing something was happening, and when Ariel saw her mother was at the center, she cried out and ran for shore. Nathan watched as the fit ended and her hands lowered, and stared in horrified silence as red dripped from her palms to stain the pure white snow. The town doctor came to see her within the hour. She was home and confined to bed, though she insisted she felt better and tried to brush it off. Clearly having the town's eyes on her bothered her, but Nathan wasn't going to let it get in the way of this. Ariel sat in dry clothes and towels by the fireplace, looking absolutely miserable. It ached. Nathan clenched his hand from his place at the table, where they'd eaten meals together nearly 2 years, waiting for the man to leave her bedroom. He was about to stand and pace when the doctor returned, and Nathan saw his face. He didn't have to say a word. Nathan knew that expression on a doctor's face. His stomach leapt into his throat, and in a moment of panic he spun to look at Ariel, shivering and terrified by the fire, before he steeled his gaze and stood, pulling the man outside. The doctor followed with relief. He didn't want the girl to know either. No cure. Little hope. A few years at best. By the time Ariel was 12, she'd likely be an orphan. There was nothing to be done. The best mages in the world were working on it, and nothing had been found yet. No small-town doctor would do better. Nathan listened in apathetic silence, feeling as if he were far, far away, staring down at the man from the end of a tunnel. He nodded in all the right places, and when the man left, Nathan went inside. Ariel was crying by the fire, shaking, staring at him with the eyes of a girl that did not dare to hope, that knew from years of living from there the cruelty of mountain life and the lives winter took, every year, even a fair winter. He crossed the room and knelt beside her in an instant and let her cry herself to sleep. For the first time since he moved there, he didn't return home that night. Nathan slept beside the fire in Deborah's house, having fed her some broth and tea. Ariel was sleeping in Deborah's bed. As the doctor had confirmed, she was no longer contagious so long as his spells held, but he couldn't bring himself to sleep in that little room. Even here, lives were lost without rhyme or reason, and a little girl was going to be without a family to care for her before she reached maturity. Even here. Beyond sorrow, he felt for the first time anger, real anger like he had on the trail, when he'd been fighting monsters who killed innocents, who murdered for fun, who tore families apart. The furious and righteous anger he'd felt then, now with no target to aim it at, no monster to hunt. He never fell asleep that night. In the morning he went home, grabbed the bag by the door, some of his parents' old books and grimoires, stuffed them inside, and returned to Deborah's house. During the day, he cared for the woman and her child, and the household Deborah could no longer watch over. She seemed healthy enough. To the normal eye, she was, but she tired easily now. Her throat wore out with talking. She couldn't do the work she used to. Nathan insisted she allow him to take over, to give her as much rest, as much time as he could. She let him. At night, by the fire, he read. He researched. He knew others had tried, but perhaps others had not tried this way. Doctors and healers studied science and magic, but few had the knowledge of alchemy a monster hunter had. Who else understood monsters as well as they, knew their parts and their uses, their weaknesses and strengths? He'd been making potions for curing wounds and healing since he was a boy. There had to be something. It was a whim of a thought. He'd been reading the recipe for another potion, one for lung diseases he thought could be promising, and saw a note in the margins. He didn't recognize the handwriting. Too many dead. Far too long for that knowledge to linger. But the potion had apparently been useful in a case with a vampire. A vampire. His hand instinctively rose to his throat, tracing the ridged edges of the scar, the gaping hole in his throat that had healed almost instantly when his mother poured the dead vampire's blood down his ruined esophagus. It hadn't healed everything. Too much damage had been done. But he should have died, and he didn't. His gaze lifted to the closed door of Deborah's bedroom, and he wondered. The thought would not leave his mind. It had its grips on him all through the day. He kept thinking about the blood and the rumors of a castle on the mountain, an ancient vampire he'd have to take care of one day anyway. Thoughts and ideas were running together, and he was making plans before he was sure he'd be acting on them. It was the only hope, the only chance he had of setting things right. At least here, at least in this sleepy little village, people should be allowed to die old and gray in their beds, to live out fulfilling lives with their families, because if not here, then what were all our deaths for? If not here, what was the point? He packed his bag light, a few specific weapons and potions he'd need, nothing too elaborate. Aw, thank you, Chrisimity. I'm doing well, I hope you are too. There was little that could hurt a vampire. Better to travel light. He packed a few empty potion vials, his knives, bows, and arrows, and his sword. Armor would be all but meaningless. Speed would be vastly more important, but still he wore his heavy boots, light mail beneath his heavy outer coat, and silver armor on his arms. One piece he did not forget, a special piece of mail made to wrap around the neck, out of silver, to defend against bites. He was dressing when Ariel came home and didn't have a moment to explain before she broke out in angry screaming. "You're leaving us!" she shouted, stamping her feet in the doorway, half ready to turn and run. "You're leaving me too!" The commotion summoned her poor mother from her room, who ran with energy she didn't have to her child's side. "Ariel, what are you—" And she saw Nathan's outfit, and something changed in her expression. But it wasn't the fear her daughter felt. "What are you planning?" Ariel's head snapped to her mother. "Huh?" Sighing, Nathan stood and grabbed the notebook on the table, the one that always stayed there, for him, full of months of his inane comments. They ran in endless lines, all next to each other, a nonsensical and never-ending paragraph. "I'm going to get you a cure." Ariel's gaze lit up. "There's a cure?" He hesitated to nod in agreement, but he wanted her to have hope. He shrugged. "I have an idea." "Nathan, you don't have to do this." Deborah stood, keeping one hand on Ariel's shoulder as she approached, and put the other on his. She still looked pretty well. He wondered how long it would take for that to change. His gaze hardened, and she saw he would not change his mind. Now we're getting to the vampire part. Had to build up the stakes. The stakes. He left that day. A neighbor volunteered to step in and help the household until he could return. He spoke to the mayor and the village elders before he left, asking about the rumor of vampires in the mountains. "Oh, aye, there's always been rumors," one man, nearly a century old, had muttered from his place beside the fire, cradled in blankets. "And records, too, old accounts of hunters they sent up the mountain, never returned, and we've never seen hide nor hair of the beast." It was a start. The domain of a vampire was never hard to find. Even one sleeping for centuries, like this one possibly was, put out an aura that attracted other things. They were the oldest of their kind, the kinfolk, half-creatures between fae and human, magical and otherworldly, yet trapped in the physical realm. Wares, merfolk, elves, and the like, all some mix of mortal and immortal blood. And vampires had more immortal blood than any other. They felt like the other world. They exuded its energy, calling other-like creatures to them, whether they wanted to or not. So when he was attacked halfway up the mountain, Nathan took it as a good sign. They were just wolves, but ravenous, red-eyed, and unnaturally violent. Nathan drew his bow and had an arrow flying through the first one's skull before it could snap at him, and drew another arrow just as quickly. But the other wolves hesitated. He let them, and they skulked back into the forest. This close to the otherworld scent, some wild animals lost themselves to the power, which meant the vampire was near. Just as he'd had the thought, the clouds parted, revealing a deep black sky and an opaque moon bright as the snow. The light reflected off the mountain in the distance, and as Nathan stared, his vision cleared, and he saw it was glass, man-made windows that sparkled in the moonlight. It was a castle, small and decrepit, no longer built against the mountain so much as slumping into it. None of that mattered, he thought, as a real grin came to his face. He'd found it. There was a technique hunters used when going into battle that allowed them to compartmentalize their lives. Outside the hunt, nothing mattered. Every stray breath, every mistimed footfall could lead to a sudden and painful end. No thoughts but the hunt could be allowed to pass into his mind, and years of training could not be undone with 2 years of retirement. The castle's shadow fell over him, and Nathan was no longer a man, but a hunter, and his prey was inside. He took even and steady breaths as he walked, stepped lightly and almost silently inside the gray halls. No mortals had lived here in some time, and it was likely the immortal had been asleep for centuries at least. If he knew more of history, he might have recognized some of the great portraits, the standards hanging in tattered rags from the ramparts. None of that mattered. It wasn't part of the hunt. Vampires tended to prefer the underground, the dark and damp. While sunlight wasn't as terrible for them as the stories said, they were quite weak to it. Legend put it to an ancient grudge with the goddess of sunlight, but who could be sure? Either way, they went out of their way to avoid it, so Nathan went down, ears pricked for any sound. The castle, despite being abandoned, showed no signs of the reason why it was left behind. No battle scars, no ancient decaying bodies slumped against the walls. It was merely empty. Nathan took this in as he turned a corner, drawing an arrow and knocking it. A door was half open at the end of the hall. The room within was lit by pillars of moonlight pouring in from the windows, and something in the darkness shifted. Nathan narrowed his gaze, stepping carefully towards the doors, pushing them open so gently they barely creaked. It was a great throne room once. Mold and mildew ruined the carpets spread across the stones from years of snowfall through the broken windows. The throne, still standing, was cracked and chipped, and sitting upon it was the vampire. He was awake. Their eyes met. A sudden gasp escaped him, unthought of for a trained hunter to be so taken by surprise. Panic gripped his chest tight, and he flashed back to the crypt, his uncle screaming, teeth like daggers stabbing into his throat. And very quickly he remembered the huge gulf that existed between every mortal and immortal in the world. He remembered exactly why he retired. The bow remained drawn. He stayed where he was and betrayed nothing more than the gasp and the quick pace of his heart to the vampire. It was enough. The beast knew. Red eyes glinted in the moonlight as he stood, stepping from the dais, a long black cape flowing behind him. He looked exactly as all the portraits of the great ancients did. Regal, royally dressed in blacks and blues lined with red, long waves of thick black hair blending neatly into the shadows behind him. He had well-trimmed facial hair for a beast so long asleep, and towered over Nathan, who was not himself a short man. How did I think I could do this? Nathan thought suddenly, panicking. His heart pounded in his throat. He remembered bodies, dozens and dozens of bodies, all the graves he'd helped to dig and the graves he'd ended up digging alone. There would be no one to dig a grave for him. You'd die a hunter's death. Suddenly the panic faded beneath a wave of relief. That was right. That was the truth. This was what life was for a hunter, fear and pain and violence. This is what had been missing every day for the last 2 years. What had he been thinking, playing pretend? He smiled, and the vampire quirked an eyebrow. Need I ask why you are here? The voice was a smooth and sultry baritone, and like many of the Fae, had the power to enchant. Nathan fought its invasion into his mind off easily. He had people to protect. His job as a hunter. I have to save Deborah and Ariel. He let the arrow fly. The vampire vanished, and it snapped in half when it struck the gray throne. That was fine. Nathan dropped the bow the moment after, quickly snapping his sickle and chain from his back, swinging it round behind him when he felt the shadows thicken. It struck and cut them in half, and they swirled and danced and flew at him, reforming as the man, claw extended. He sidestepped the blow and threw it off with his arm, but it was a near thing. What is the purpose of this? The man asked. I have harmed nothing in these mountains. Last I woke, there were no humans in these mountains. Well, that was quite a while. Unfortunately, he didn't exactly have a polite way of asking the vampire to kindly give him some of his blood. Not that the vampire would deign to help a mortal, after all. They were far more like Fae than they were humankind. He'd never known it more assuredly than in this moment. Nathan kept pace with the creature, but he could feel the monster holding back. It wasn't invested in the fight, didn't see him as a threat, and it wasn't wrong. He was barely doing anything to hurt it. Snarling, Nathan leapt back and swung his sickle again, slicing shadows and doppelgangers apart as he darted across the room, seeking the real figure. There. The monster let himself be seen, and Nathan took the opportunity, made as if to charge at him, as the beast expected, and at the last minute completely switched momentum. He slid to his knees, let the sickle's chain fly from his hand round the creature's legs, who'd expected an upfront assault. The binding spell was cast before he consciously thought it, and it worked. The chain broke off from the sickle, and the silver bound the creature's legs, throbbing with light. He was tied to the physical world. That caught his attention if the red leaking into his corneas was any sign. You had your chance. A bestial growl slipped into his voice, and the creature's teeth lengthened. Choking, pain. Nathan flung the memories aside and clung to his mission, to the hunt, to Ariel, Deborah, the only family he had left. And as the monster flew at him, he realized they were going to get to bury him, if they could find the pieces left. He drew the sword from his back too late. The beast's claws swiped into his chest, and the force flung him back into the wall, and something in his chest cracked. A silent scream tore its way out of his throat, but he didn't indulge the pain. Head snapping up, he grimaced and lifted the blade, tore across the room as the creature flew at him, long cape fluttering out and extending into darkness, intimidating and overwhelming. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Not the broken ribs, not the blood coming up his throat from his lungs. None of it mattered. He had to succeed. That was all. Surviving didn't matter. Only the hunt. Just like a hunter, he smiled through the pain at the thought, swung his blade high as the beast dodged, let the blade go with the momentum, and spun it to face the creature where he reappeared, tearing into his shoulder. The monster roared in righteous anger, and it occurred to him that for once the monster truly was the victim. After this, it certainly wouldn't leave any nearby humans alone. At least not me. He met the vampire's claws with his blade again and again, flushed and panting. He's going to come back for revenge. Even if I win here, I won't escape unless I kill him. Could he? Nathan had never killed anything that hadn't first killed others. Many of the kinfolk were kindly creatures, like humans, good and bad. Some of them grew angry at their human brethren and took out what they saw as vengeance against them. Others simply liked the taste of their meat. But the true number of monstrous kinfolk to kind was likely small, but a small handful could do so much damage to so many people. This vampire hadn't done any of that, and Nathan found himself realizing he couldn't bring himself to kill it. Worry about it later. Mission first. Grimacing, he threw all the power he could into his next blow, snapping some of the claws off the beast's hands. They regrew, but not before he sliced through the creature's arm. He started fighting back harder, rougher, holding nothing in reserve. What did it matter? Living and surviving were no longer the goal, just winning. But the wounds on the beast healed nearly as fast as he could inflict them. The chain remained, binding his legs, but hardly restricting his movement. It only kept him from turning into shadow. Somehow he had to bind the rest of the beast. With the next blow, he let his sword fly free from his hand, and it struck into a column behind him. The vampire looked surprised. Nathan took his chance. Either hand dashed to his waist as he withdrew his knives, flew forward, and leapt onto the creature, stabbing both of them into either shoulder. He cast as he did. Even as the creature's claws pierced his chest and blood bubbled pink up his throat, he cast the spell, poured more life than he should have into it. He poured his misery, his fear, and 2 years' worth of grief he'd avoided facing, poured it into the knives. It flowed through and met the chain's spell, the energies intertwining, and chains of silver light emerged from the ether, tying tight around the beast. The momentum carried them to the wall where the knives embedded and stuck, and the beast was trapped. It must have shocked him, for the creature's eyes widened and his claws retracted. It was agony, but it set Nathan free, and he collapsed at the beast's feet, soaked in his own blood and sweat. It took time, a long time, for him to stand again. He wasn't actually sure how much time, to be honest. He stood and met the furious red eyes of the creature as it snarled at him. "Well," it roared, inhuman and angry. "You've won, haven't you? Kill your monster, hunter. Claim your prize. I am sure my corpse will be a great boon to you." The words might prick if he were a little more aware and less in awe of his success. Ignoring the beast, he stumbled to his bag, dropped with his bow by the door. His progress was slow. The world shifted and turned in front of him. He grabbed a potion from the bag with unsteady hands, struggling to uncap it as blood-soaked fingers slid up and down the glass. Once it was down his throat, he felt grounded, a little better. Reaching inside, he grabbed the 3 empty vials, then stumbled over to his sword. The beast was still glowering at him with such an intense amount of anger it staggered him. Another suggestion, an attempt to override his will to kill the vampire. Lucky for him, that wasn't his goal. He lifted the sword with trembling hands to the vampire's neck. The creature glared at him, but did not beg for his life. He held his head high. It would take decapitation and burning to truly kill a vampire. Nathan drew his sword through the neck, deep enough to bleed, but no deeper. Blood poured from the wound, and with trembling hands he lifted the vials one at a time to catch the blood. He didn't look at the creature's eyes as he stoppered them and stumbled back. In his hand he held a spell, prepared hours before he'd left, tucked in with the vials. Hands raised, holding the paper and the 3 vials in hand, he closed his eyes and focused. What power remained in his trembling limbs flowed to his palms, and light flared between his fingers. Nathan fell to his knees, arms falling limp. The vials were gone. If the spell had gone well, it would teleport the vials and his instructions to the town doctor. If he was right, and the doctor did as the letter said, then maybe Ariel and Deborah would be all right. He slumped to the ground, a broken doll, chest heaving, attempting to vomit and coming up with nothing but blood bubbling pink over his lips. It ached with every convulsion, throat constricting, eyes burning, his heart a pounding drum echoing in his ears. Is this what they felt? Catherine bled out, her legs crushed. No broken ribs or crushed lungs, but certainly she'd have felt this aching pull, this emptying agony as every heartbeat sent his life pulsing out onto the ground. Terry, drowned under the waves, must have felt this tightness in his chest, perhaps the burning of salt in his eyes. George had had his whole ribcage crushed in a werewolf's jaws. He went so quick. Did it feel like this? Boy. The voice was very close and so very far. Eventually your spells will wear out on me, but you'll be long dead by then. Release them before you cannot any more. In spite of himself, in spite of the pain, Nathan laughed. Tears poured down his face and blended with the blood on his cheeks, his chin, his arms and legs, even his hair. It was pooling underneath him, too much, too sticky and hot. It was euphoric. It was horrific. It was finally going to be over. The pain was starting to go away. His vision danced and flashed with light, twisting under the hazy influence of whatever desperate cocktail his brain came up with to try and keep him alive. Soon it would be over. His head lolled to the side, looking upside down at the vampire. He could only see a fluttering shape, a dancing shadow, a giant bat, wings fluttering in the air between bright flashes of light. Foolish boy, you'll die if you wait any longer. Perhaps it wanted to drink him while he was still fresh. Perhaps it wanted him to remain alive so he could kill him all over again, more slowly. Mom? Dad? Did it hurt like this? I hope it didn't hurt like this. Please, God, let it not have hurt like this. Not for you, or Terry, or George, or Rachel. God, Rachel, I am sorry I was so slow and I watched you die. Please don't let it hurt like this. The blades left the vampire's flesh and tumbled to the floor as Nathan ended the spell, never aware that some part of him, some primal, terrified creature yearning to live, had pulled the magic back. He couldn't feel his hands. His vision was bright flashes and dark shades. His ears rang louder and louder. I'm sorry I let you hurt like this. I'm sorry I don't want to hurt anymore. Please don't let it hurt anymore. I want to be with you. I don't want to hurt anymore. It's all right. Hands in his hair, pressure on his chest. Hush now, it's all right. It will never be all right because they are dead and it hurt so bad when they died. He hurt and they hurt and everything always hurts. And he's always afraid of more hurts, and now the worst one is here. It's happening. What he's lived his life so afraid of, the brutal hunter's death. And will it finally end and the pain go away? Will he finally see them again? Or is it just over now, finally over, and the pain is over, and he is gone? Something warm and soothing like broth in the dead of winter's coldest night. He felt the warm tingling spread down his throat, through his chest, until the tip of every finger fluttered with the feeling, the way muscles tingle when blood returns after too long. The feeling passed in waves, tingles traveling down his limbs, and then another wave of warmth and feeling returned as the tingling passed. Solidity returned to him, the sensation of feeling heavy, exhausted, weighed down and sore, half asleep and yet feeling unconscious, too tired to really be aware. More warmth, and he finally could open his eyes, if only for a moment, for a blink, but they were too heavy and fell shut again. He awoke to hear the glorious news. Deborah was going to be fine. It was a miracle, the doctor said as he checked over Nathan's bandages. The man was in a patient's bed at the doctor's office, blinking at the roof and rubbing his eyes. The doctor wanted to talk to him about his methods and what potion he'd made as soon as he was healthier himself, and the man couldn't stop smiling the whole visit. Nathan barely processed anything he was saying, too shocked and busy staring at his twitching fingers as he lifted his arm. He'd done it. Deborah and Ariel would be fine. The doctor left, and he laid in the sunlight, watching out the window, feeling sore and satisfied for the first time in ages. She was alive. Deborah was going to live and raise her daughter, and everything was fine. He could just picture it now. Ariel running home from school, chattering on about her lessons and her friends and her dreams of being a hunter. Deborah at home cooking stew, sewing by the fire, laughing at her daughter's stories. The beautiful, perfect day they would get to have every day of their lives. The way of the world was set right again. He sat up. It took longer than he wanted it to, but that was fine. He had to be well enough to move. Waiting any longer would bring destruction upon the village. He'd head back up the mountain. Less likely the vampire would come across the village first and wreak vengeance. Surely it would. Nathan could not remember how in the world he survived, but he had to assume his magic had kicked in to save him, perhaps teleporting him here when the settlement found him. The spells on the vampire would not last forever, and when they faded, it was going to come for Nathan. I'm not going to survive this. He stood and stretched, sore muscles rubbing at his throat. 2 years ago, this was his worst fear, dying alone and in pain, spending all his days hunting, half terrified and covered in blood, and always alone. Now he knew the truth. He suffered so others could live. That was just the way it was. Eventually, all suffering would end. His close brush with eternal sleep and the empty warmth of it, like returning to the womb, had taught him that. Dying wouldn't be so bad. Maybe he wouldn't see his family again, but at least it would be over. His bag was in the doctor's office, thankfully. He didn't want to make any goodbyes. Better they think he simply left, that he returned to the hunter's life and they could return to theirs. It was a nice dream for a while. "Nathan!" Heart leaping into his throat, the man couldn't help but stop. Ariel was a blur as she ran full speed into his legs, and he couldn't help but wince as he caught her. She was crying happy tears, eyes wide and grinning as she grabbed his hands. "You did it! Mom's gonna be fine! You saved her! You have to tell me what you did and where you went and... Where are you going?" Her eyes glanced to the bag on his back, and when their eyes met again, he felt shame curl like poison in his belly. The smile fell away from her face. "You're leaving again, but why?" How could he explain? With no way to write, no way to hand-speak to the child who barely knew a few signs. And what would he even say? He could never tell her the truth. Or perhaps he should, let her know what the truth of a hunter was, being alone and dying in the dark, so she would never desire to be one again. All he could do was kneel and grab her tight as she sobbed into his shoulder. When he let her go, she leaned back, eyes staring wide behind him. "Who's that?" Darkness. Nathan leapt to his feet and spun around, drawing his dagger from his waist, terror nearly throwing him off his feet. It couldn't be, not yet, but he felt it. The burning presence, the shadow, and there he was, standing 3 feet away, and he'd never known, and Ariel was right. She stepped round him and waved. "Are you Nathan's friend?" The vampire looked at her and smiled. "My name is Kieran." "I'm Ariel." She looked back at Nathan. "Is that why you're leaving, to go with your friend?" Panic and shock warred inside him as he watched the unsettling scene, heart pounding, wounds aching, and next he knew he ran at the creature, knife in hand, pushing Ariel behind him and hoping desperately she would understand to run. The gut punch was rather unexpected, given what the vampire could do, what it had done. The pain was enough to shake his whole body and for his hand to loosen and drop the knife. The pain. He blacked out, faded in and out for a while. Voices in the distance, familiar and yet not. They were so far away. Were they his family, calling for him beyond the veil? "It won't be long now, I promise," he told them. "I'm going to have a hunter's death." He awoke at home. It was so surreal for a moment he wondered if he was finally dead. It passed quickly. He was in far too much pain to be a spirit. His head ached, every piece of his body hurt to move, and the very pulse in his chest felt like a wound, his headache increasing with the sound pounding in his ears. Awake again. Struggling to open his eyes, he turned to see a shadow by the fire. The room was all darkness, the windows had been closed, the curtains drawn, the fireplace the only light. It flickered across the sharp bones of the monster's face as it turned to face him, and he froze, like a rabbit recognizing a predator. The vampire stared at him for a moment, then nodded to the ground beside him. "Drink, but not too much. You could not handle it now." Shock drained some of the terror from him as he glanced at the water pouch beside him. He was on the floor of his little house, covered in far more blankets than he knew he owned, made into a makeshift pallet on the floor. He was bruised and bloodied but alive, and his near killer was sitting beside him. "You don't speak." Surprised, Nathan looked up. He nodded. "The little girl told me. Ariel. She called you her father, sort of." That made the creature chuckle as it looked back into the flames. "She explained in detail as we walked here the miracle you pulled today, saving her mother's life." Cold ice slid down his spine. Eyes narrowed, he grabbed at the bookshelf nearby, wrenching the closest piece of paper down and grabbing a pencil, writing across it. "What do you want?" "You attacked me," the monster said, eyes narrowed. Then he hummed. "You threw your life away against me, all to steal a few pints of blood. Through the haze of anger and pain, that piqued my curiosity. I found myself wondering why you wanted it, why it was worth your life, whatever for." He couldn't stop his heart pounding in his chest as he listened, eyes darting around for a weapon, any weapon, but the beast had clearly hidden them all. "I believe you realized, or you released the binding spell unconsciously, or perhaps the magic gave when you came near to death. Nice work, by the way, with that spell. You're quite the talent. So I used my blood to heal you, just as you no doubt had planned to do for Miss Deborah. You could have followed suit." Confused, Nathan narrowed his brow and went to write his question when the monster continued. "One vial was enough to heal her mortal sickness. You could have drunk the other, drank them all and taken more from me and healed your wounds. Instead, you sent the blood away and fell to the floor and surrendered to the inevitable." The monster fell silent for far too long, long enough that the quiet felt like a judgment. "Are you so eager to die?" "Yes. No." He didn't want to die. He wanted to be alive. But that wasn't for him, not for people like him, and he was tired of waiting for the death that was coming to finally arrive, for the terrible thing in the darkness to get him. He was going to die cold and alone, the last of his line, torn to pieces by a monster, bleeding out alone, or watching as something ripped out his intestines and ate them, and there would be no one to mourn him. It had happened to everyone else, so it would happen to him, and he was exhausted waiting for it. He wasn't allowed to have this. The vampire said nothing, but his eyes stayed trained on Nathan's trembling face as he glared back. He wrote nothing down. Let the beast think what it wanted. It seemed clear the creature meant no harm to the village. How it felt about him, he wasn't sure. He didn't want to talk to it anymore. He wanted it to leave. "Very well, Nathan," the monster whispered, and suddenly he found himself very tired. "Rest. Your troubles will be there in the morning." He dreamt that night. Nathan had dreams most night, which most people would probably call nightmares, but that he never saw that way, because it was the only time he saw his family. They always ended dying, watching someone die, or the corpses of his loved ones watching him pass on, grasping hands, pulling off limbs, and peeling off skin while he thrashed and bled out. This time it was the vampire tearing open his ribcage, cracking the bones and pulling them away to shove beneath his lungs and hold his heart, grip tight and possessive, lips red as he smiled down at Nathan, and the pressure started to build, blood seizing in his chest. He awoke alone. Most days he did, which was what made the last few times he awoke so strange. It had been a while since he'd slept in his own house, too, not since Deborah first got sick a few months before. All he could think was it was terribly cold. Soreness sunk in before he could fully stretch and sit up, pulling at his exhausted limbs, piercing his chest with sharp stabs when he moved too quickly or turned too sharply. His bones throbbed, especially his ribs, but they weren't broken anymore. He never should have healed this quickly. Vampire blood was as good as his mother had said. Finally, he was standing, and found himself remaining that way, motionless, not sure what to do with himself. There was nothing to do. His main concern for months was finally no longer an issue, and his body was far too weak to go about looking for something to do. Rest seemed to be all he could manage, but it was the last thing he wanted, to sit still with only his empty house and thoughts for company. But he didn't want to see Deborah or Ariel again yet. He knew they were alive. The vampire would have shown off their corpses while he was here if he wanted to make Nathan suffer. And he couldn't face the questions, the concerns, the look in their eyes he knew would be there. The gratitude. It was always the worst part of the hunt. Where was the vampire? Had it really gone? Returned to slumber? Curiosity about Nathan sated, no longer concerned about any of them? Or was it merely waiting, buying its time? Neither answer really felt right to Nathan. Would the creature go out of its way to save him, only to vanish without a trace? He no longer thought the vampire, Kieran, it had told Ariel, was a threat, at least not to the townsfolk. He'd been sleeping in his castle longer than the town had existed, and vampires that went such long periods without hunting prey, which was literally right on their doorstep, probably had little interest in hunting humans. They could go without blood. It wasn't necessary, they just enjoyed it. So what was the vampire's purpose in saving him? If it were just to understand why he'd been attacked in the first place, the mystery was solved. Certainly the vampire had returned to his castle and his long slumber, or perhaps back to the Fae. He'd leave Nathan alone. But if he was still here, still lingering with the goal of taking something from him, be it blood, revenge, what have you, then Nathan moved to his pack and removed one of his knives, carefully cleaned by a thorough hand while he was asleep. If the vampire had designs on him, it would appear to keep him from taking his life. If it didn't appear, then it moved on and had no interest in him. If it did... Nathan swallowed dryly, falling back onto his piles of blankets by the fire, hand trembling a little as he stared into his shaking reflection on the blade. For only a moment he met his own gaze, when the blade just as quickly vanished from his sight. "I was gone," the vampire tutted, twirling the blade in his gloved hand, "for 5 minutes. His eyes fell on the tall figure, long black curls falling over broad shoulders. An instinct kicked in. Nathan lunged for the knife, which was quickly held out of his reach, and unless he wanted to stand on his toes and reach for it like a child, there was no taking it back. "Must I set up wards on this house to keep you from harming yourself?" The vampire raised an eyebrow, questioning. Suddenly furious, Nathan turned and ran to his bookshelf, snatching the nearest notebook he could find. "Don't bother," came the deep voice from behind him. "You needn't such things with me." Turning, Nathan saw the man smirk and tap the side of his head. Of course. The first time he drank a vampire's blood, the creature had been killed. This time they were both alive, and vampire blood was incredibly magical, powerful stuff. He didn't know for sure what it could do. Few hunters had ever gotten close enough to a vampire to learn, but a mental bond certainly would be possible. Ugh, a vampire in his head. Terrific. "You can tone down the disgust." The smirk grew more prominent somehow. "I'm not reading your mind or anything so foolish, but I can feel something of an echo of what you do." He twirled the knife in the air one last time before tucking it away somewhere under his cloak. "If you direct your thoughts towards me, I should understand your meaning." Which meant no more having to take time to write it down. At least that was convenient. Still, it felt strange to stand there and just think words at the man, so while he was thinking, he started using hand speech too. "What are you doing here?" "I'm keeping you alive, apparently." He crossed his arms. "What you really want to know is whether or not I plan to hurt you or those around you, is it not?" The vampire's expression grew more serious, the smirk falling away. "For whatever it's worth, I assure you I am not. Not all of my kind are ferocious beasts, you should know." He did. Hunters killed errant kinfolk, but they were also by necessity the most experienced with living and working beside the kin and the Fae. They first learned to hunt from the Fae, who felt responsibility towards humans for the kinfolk they'd unleashed upon them, first learned magic from them, created the various treaties between the elves, dwarves, and other major races that still existed today. Hunters knew the best and worst of the others, which was why Nathan feared this vampire so. He'd gotten lucky the first time. If the vampire ever decided to attack him for real, there would be no stopping him. "My name," the vampire said, "is Kieran." Right, hearing thoughts. Nathan scowled and tried to rein his anxiety in. It was difficult. Anxiety was something he lived with constantly, every moment of every day, and having someone standing 2 feet away from him who was the living embodiment of what he most feared, the possibility of death at the hands of a creature he could never stop, it had him vibrating beneath his skin. He couldn't trust this Kieran, because he couldn't trust that this wouldn't end poorly. It always did. A heavy sigh, and the vampire's irritation seemed to slip off his back like a cloak. Everything he did was so elegant, even the expressions of annoyance that on anyone else would be childish and rude. "Give me your hand." Confused, frightened, overwhelmed, Nathan didn't move. Another sigh, and the vampire reached out and took his hand, forcefully but gently, and held it tight between both of his. I, Kieran O'Brodegan, swear upon my name that no harm shall come to you or the ones you love at my hand. A flash of light between their fingers, a sudden spreading warmth. Realization sunk into him, and wide eyes met the vampire's gaze. Is that good enough for you? It was a spell, one of the oldest kinds. An oath on a Fae's name was binding, and vampires were Fae enough for it to work. If he broke his word, if he did hurt Nathan, or Deborah, or Ariel, his very existence would be unwritten, the laws of magic which made him, unmaking him. It was as good as suicide. Relief, selfish and pure, slid down his spine like a bucket of water over his head, and Nathan's knees went weak. There now, careful. Strong arms wrapped around his middle, lowering him to the floor. Careful, we wouldn't want to undo all my hard work, would we? Exhaustion sunk Nathan's eyelids, and though he tried to fight it, he really found he couldn't. Get some more rest. You're safe. I swear it. Many people had told him he was safe at various points of his life. His mother with a gentle smile and her calloused hands rustling his hair, his father's warm arm settling on his shoulder, his older siblings pulling him into half a hug and tugging him along with them. They'd all promised he'd be safe, and they'd given their lives trying to make it true, but none of them had ever really been safe. For the first time in his life, Nathan felt it was true. This time. That's as far as I've gotten. I'm glad that you folks seem to enjoy it. It's been a very long time since I've tried to write plot and not just... I don't know. It's been a while since I've tried to make a universe. This is set in a universe that I've already created, but it's new characters, new idea, and I don't know. I was enjoying exploring, like, the trauma side of it that I think some more and more often nowadays, Witcher, Castlevania, the anime series are getting more into the trauma of that kind of life, but I wanted to get into it, like, how terrible that survivor's guilt must be when you have, like, a family clan that hunts, but they're not gonna live, and how perfect the setting would be with vampires, since, you know, those are always the most sexual, the most powerful, the most, you know, perfect for a romantic setting anyway. And there's a lot of, like, intimacy that is built into the concept of the vampire that a character who has been burned and had all this trauma before would both struggle with and kind of desire, you know? It'll be a long road to get there. Literally all this so far is just, who is this guy that I'm writing? It hasn't even built up, like, the actual plot and who the vampire is and what's going to happen. I have a lot of ideas and things that I'm playing with about where it's going to go, but literally this was just building, I guess, really the character. Why is he struggling? What is he doing? I'm definitely going to continue it, but I'm not sure where. I had struggled for a while with what was... I had written up to the moment that he fought the vampire, and then I was like, okay, what now? Like, how does that play out? Because I knew I wanted the two of them to end up together, but I wasn't sure how the switch goes from, we're fighting right now, and then what? And then I realized, of course, like, I liked the idea of him experiencing, in a way, a death. That he does die, because his whole time has been the fear that he's going to die, because he's lived with it hanging over his head his whole life. So he dies a hunter's death, but surprise, the vampire saves him, and now is basically imprinted on him like a duck. Everyone keeps doing this. Yes, sex, murder, and suffering should be my tagline. And that's all vampires are. I'll definitely play more with the Fae and stuff, too. Like I said, this is a setting I've written in before, lots of other stories, but I've never played with the vampire side of it. Basically, it's a fantasy world based heavily on Ireland and Irish myths, and the Fae folk, the court of the Fae, is the center of all magic and magical creatures, and the kinfolk are anything that exists in the physical real world but is magical. They're kind of an accident of magic that happened because the Fae like to fuck around and find out, you know, like, so that's why you have succubi and demons and, you know, all these monsters that kind of exist between the two worlds. And the vampires are the most powerful of them. So yeah, I don't really know where exactly the story will go. It will be happier from here. It'll be more about healing and moving forward. But you have to set up the why the healing is so important first. And that makes it, hurt more in a good way later when you know how hard it was to get here. And I love writing characters with disabilities. What's up, sweetheart? Tell her I'm streaming. I'll be down in a moment. Why nobody can just call me? Goodness. Well, we'll finish this up. Yeah, I like horror. I like adding horror aspects to my stories, but I also like making romantic horror. I like the combination of intimacy and violence is fascinating to me. I just love it, and vampires are the crux of that. And there's just a lot of fun ideas I think could be explored here. I'm glad folks seem to like it, because honestly, I'm rough. It's been a long time since I've written personally, professionally. Probably not since college, since I've really published anything or shared anything. So I was like, time to see how we're doing and if it works well. There will be more eventually. I don't know if I'll read anymore. I needed to make sure I still had it. And I guess it seems like folks enjoyed it, so hopefully that means I do. I will have to, whenever I do finally finish and put it together some point, I will let y'all know. It'll be a while, because I'm still, basically rough drafting it out and figuring out where it's going. But now, finally, the two guys are together. It only took 14,000 words and a lot of angst. But thanks for listening. No more streams today because I did kill my voice reading this, but I'm glad that folks liked it. That's very awesome. Can you say bye, Bob? Say bye, Bob. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.